My name is Emily. I'm 36, a mother, a widow, and someone who spent the last 3 years learning how to breathe again after losing the love of my life. Before Tom, before Mason, it was just Jake and me, navigating the quiet chaos of grief and rebuilding a life that had been abruptly shattered. I worked hard to keep our routines, to honor my husband's memory, and to give Jake some sense of stability. We had our little traditions: Saturday pancake mornings, bedtime stories with whispered memories of his dad, and quiet moments by the mantel where the urn sat like a sentinel of love we could never replace. Meeting Tom had seemed like a gentle promise of something new. I had been lonely, craving companionship, and maybe, unconsciously, a chance at normalcy. Tom was patient, kind, and he made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. Our first date was simple: a coffee shop where we talked for hours about everything and nothing. I remember noticing how he listened, really listened, when I talked about Jake, about my late husband, about the grief I carried like a hidden weight. For the first time in a long time, I thought it was possible to imagine a future that included someone else. Tom's son, Mason, entered my life cautiously at first. He was 11, with sharp eyes that seemed to measure me constantly. I knew from Tom that Mason had struggled with boundaries, with expressing emotions, and that the divorce from his own father had left scars. I told myself I could handle it. I wanted to be patient. I wanted to give Jake a family again, to build something safe and loving. The early months were a mix of hope and tension. Mason could be sweet, charming even, in moments that made my heart ache for what I hoped he could be. But there were signs I couldn't ignore: subtle manipulations, small acts of defiance, moments when he seemed to test the limits of not just me, but Jake as well. I often rationalized it. He's adjusting. He needs time. He's protective of his relationship with his father. He's a child. I wanted to believe in the good, and I wanted to believe that love could fix what life had broken. And then there was the dynamic with Tom's family. They were kind enough, but they had their expectations. A stepmother to Mason had to be understanding, patient, accommodating. I tried to navigate their subtle judgments, their questions about whether I could truly manage a blended family. I smiled, nodded, reassured, even when I felt the weight of being evaluated like some measure of worthiness. It wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about proving I could belong in this other world too. I remember quiet evenings when Jake would curl up against me, talking about his father, asking questions about heaven, about memory, about whether his dad could see him now. I would hold him close and answer as best I could, trying to weave the grief and the love together into something that felt safe. Meanwhile, Mason's presence loomed, unpredictable, and I began to notice subtle changes in Jake: hesitation, fear of expressing his grief too openly, tiptoeing around Mason's moods. I told myself it was adjustment, that blended families were complicated, but deep inside I felt unease creeping like a shadow, a whisper of trouble that I couldn't yet name. Looking back, the signs were there from the beginning. The moments when Mason's gaze lingered too long on Jake's things, when he seemed to observe, to calculate. I chose to overlook them, hoping that patience and love would be enough. I wanted to believe in a happy ending, in the possibility that our fractured family could become whole again. But love, I would learn, has limits. Some wounds are not healed by kindness, and some acts, deliberate and cruel, cannot be ignored. At first, the tensions were subtle, almost invisible. Mason wasn't openly hostile, but there was a quiet edge to him, a way of watching that made me uneasy. I noticed how he would linger near Jake's toys, or brush past him in a way that seemed intentional, almost possessive. I told myself these were minor sibling-like squabbles, typical in any blended household. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was testing me, testing Jake, testing the boundaries of what was sacred in our home. Tom, naturally, was protective of Mason. He had been through a lot. The absence of Mason's father had left scars, and he tried to shield his son from criticism. I respected that. I wanted to trust him, but his patience sometimes came across as leniencies toward behaviors that were more than just childish mischief. When I mentioned concerns, broken toys, subtle intimidation, or Mason taking Jake's things without asking, Tom would sigh and reassure me. "He's adjusting, Emily. He's been through a lot." I wanted to believe him. I really did. I wanted to believe that love could fix these fractures. Friends and family added their own complications. Tom's sister, for example, seemed to expect me to be endlessly accommodating, reminding me gently but insistently that Mason's past trauma required understanding. I nodded, smiled, and tried to internalize their advice, all while watching Jake shrink a little each day, hiding his grief, hiding his possessions, trying not to attract attention. There were small moments that now, in hindsight, were harbingers of disaster. Mason deliberately ignored rules, pushed Jake away from his favorite chair, and even mocked his stories about his father. I would intervene, trying to balance fairness with firmness, but Mason's defiance always seemed calculated. He was intelligent, observant, and cruel in ways that were subtle enough to make me question myself. Was I being too harsh? Too quick to judge? The air in our home became heavier. I noticed Jake's hesitation before sharing memories of his father, the way he would glance over his shoulder when Mason was nearby. He started avoiding his usual routines, tiptoeing through the house in silence. I realized, with a pit forming in my stomach, that our home, once a place of love, grief, and healing, was becoming a minefield. Tom remained convinced that everything was a phase, that Mason needed time and love to adjust. I wanted to trust him, but each incident chipped away at that trust. The small acts of defiance, the lingering looks, the careful timing of Mason's provocations, they were mounting, creating an invisible tension that we all felt but no one admitted. And yet there were moments of charm, moments when Mason could be sweet, even loving, making it impossible to dismiss him as simply bad. It made me question my instincts, made me doubt myself. But the pattern was becoming clear. Mason targeted what mattered most, what held emotional significance. And as a mother, a widow, I knew instinctively what that meant. Jake and the memory of his father were in danger. The tension built quietly, invisibly, until it could no longer be contained. I had ignored the warning signs, hoping love and patience could smooth over the cracks. But deep down, I feared that something catastrophic was waiting just around the corner. That moment of dread, that gnawing feeling of inevitability, was the seed of conflict that would soon explode in a way none of us could have anticipated. The party had been perfect, at least I thought it was. Jake's laughter echoed through the house, a melody I hadn't heard in months. He was opening gifts with wide-eyed delight, surrounded by cousins and friends who adored him. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we were reclaiming the joy that had been stolen by grief. Then Mason disappeared upstairs for 10 minutes. I didn't think much of it. I trusted that he was playing or exploring, as any 11-year-old might. But when he came back down, there was that look, half smile, half smirk, the kind of expression that makes your stomach drop. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was nothing. Jake was opening his last present near the fireplace, a small handcrafted toy car his father had once cherished. I was kneeling beside him, helping him unwrap it, when Mason suddenly lunged past everyone. He grabbed the urn from the mantel. Time slowed. I saw him lift it high, heard the soft gasp of every adult in the room, and then the sound that will haunt me forever, the shattering of clay against stone. Pieces of the urn flew across the hearth, the floor, even onto the furniture. Ashes, my husband's ashes, spilled everywhere. Jake's scream tore through me, raw and unfiltered. He didn't cry. He screamed. I have never heard a child sound so broken. My heart stopped. My mind froze. And yet, I moved instinctively, grabbing Mason by the shoulders. I didn't hurt him. I held him tightly, staring into his eyes, demanding silently, "Why?" "Oops," he said, with a small, almost triumphant smile. That smile, it confirmed what my gut already knew. This wasn't an accident. I called 911 immediately, hands shaking, voice cracking. Tom lost it. He shouted, trying to justify Mason's actions, claiming he was just a kid, and it must have been a mistake. He accused me of traumatizing Mason by involving the police. But I saw that smile. I knew it wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. The room was silent except for Jake, who continued to scream, covering his ears, tears streaming down his face. I swept up what I could of the ashes, but most were lost. 3 years of carefully preserving a connection between Jake and his father, gone in seconds. When the police arrived, they took statements, documented everything. Mason stuck to the story of an accident at first, but when asked to explain how he accidentally climbed a chair 6 feet high and threw a fragile urn onto the hardest surface in the room, his story began to fall apart. I watched him squirm and my chest ached, not just for the urn, but for Jake, who was witnessing his mother's life's work destroyed by someone who should have been a friend. Tom tried to argue with the officers, but I stood my ground. I wasn't angry at Mason yet. I was furious, but clear-headed. I needed the law involved, for Jake, for what was right. This was beyond discipline. This was deliberate, cruel, and targeted. After the officers left, Tom and I had a long, tense conversation. I confronted him about the warning signs I had noticed about Mason's calculated behavior. He broke down, admitting that Mason had been through trauma, that his father had left, and that he was angry in ways he couldn't express. I listened, but my mind was fixed on one undeniable truth. Mason knew exactly what he was doing. And then he said the words that ended any chance of compromise. "You're choosing your dead husband over my living son." I stared at him, my body frozen, my mind screaming, "No." I wasn't choosing my husband over anyone. I was choosing to protect my child from someone who had deliberately hurt him. That was the only choice a parent could make. In that moment, I realized the stakes had changed. This wasn't about love, compromise, or family blending. This was about safety. And some boundaries, once violated, cannot be crossed again. After the chaos settled, the house felt emptier than ever. The laughter, the balloons, the warmth of family, it all evaporated, leaving a hollow silence. I sat on the floor, surrounded by shards of the urn and the scattered ashes, my hands trembling. Jake was on the bed upstairs, curled into a ball, his little body shaking with silent sobs. I wanted to run to him, to hold him, but I knew I had to steady myself first. The anger surged, hot and raw. How could an 11-year-old understand the weight of what he had done? How could Tom protect him while dismissing the reality of Jake's trauma? My mind raced, replaying Mason's smile, that deliberate, triumphant expression that had marked the destruction. I couldn't get it out of my head. It was burned into my memory. I questioned myself relentlessly. Had I ignored warning signs? Was I too patient, too accommodating? Could I have prevented this? My grief intertwined with guilt. I had spent 3 years carefully preserving Jake's connection to his father, honoring every memory, every tradition, and now it was gone. And yet, this wasn't Jake's fault. This was deliberate, and he had suffered the consequences of someone else's cruelty. I went upstairs and sat beside Jake, hesitating for a moment before touching his shoulder. "Buddy," I whispered, my voice breaking, "I need you to know. What happened wasn't your fault. It wasn't an accident. You didn't do anything wrong." He looked at me, wide-eyed, and I could see the confusion and fear swimming in his gaze. "He looked happy when he did it," he murmured, his small voice trembling. "Are you mad at me?" "No, sweetheart," I said, pulling him into my arms. "I'm mad at myself for not protecting you better, but I am not mad at you. Mommy, your dad's ashes were special because they were all we had left, but the love and the memories we carry, they can't be destroyed. No one can take that from us." As we sat together, I felt a storm of emotions: grief, fury, heartbreak, and determination. I realized that my responsibility wasn't just to mourn what was lost, but to protect Jake from further harm. Every instinct I had, every fiber of my being, screamed that I could never allow someone who deliberately hurt him to remain in our lives without consequences. I thought about Tom, about how he couldn't see the difference between an accident and an intentional act. He was caught between love for Mason and understanding the magnitude of what had happened. But I couldn't let that confusion compromise Jake's safety. My loyalty, my duty, was clear. Calling the police was the first step, but it was only the beginning. I had to confront the reality of Mason's behavior, the pattern of targeting what mattered to others, and the fact that Tom had minimized these signs for months. I had to make decisions that were painful, decisions that might fracture relationships further, but I knew they were necessary. Sitting there with Jake, I made a silent vow. I would do everything in my power to protect him, to rebuild a sense of security, to honor the memory of his father in a way no one could take from us. I would not let fear or discomfort guide my actions. I would not let my desire for a blended family cloud my judgment. My son's safety and emotional well-being came first, always. I held him longer, feeling the fragility of his trust and the weight of my responsibility. The house was still filled with remnants of destruction, but in that moment, a different resolve took root. I would face the challenges ahead with clarity, with courage, and with unwavering commitment to my child. I would not allow this moment to define our future. Jake's resilience and my resolve would. And yet, even as I comforted him, a quiet ache lingered. Mason's deliberate act had exposed a truth I had tried to ignore. Some children, even loved ones, can be dangerous in ways that are calculated and cruel. Recognizing that truth was painful, but necessary. Protecting Jake meant acknowledging it fully, without compromise. The days that followed were a storm I could never have prepared for. Tessa, Mason's mother, was relentless. She called repeatedly, her voice oscillating between tears and accusations. "Emily, you're overreacting. He's just a kid. You're traumatizing him more than the accident itself." Her words were sharp, but I could hear the panic beneath them, the fear that Mason might face consequences for actions she had long excused. I tried to explain calmly, but reason often fell on deaf ears. "This wasn't an accident," I said firmly. "Mason deliberately destroyed something sacred to my son. It's not about punishment, it's about accountability and protecting Jake." But Tessa couldn't see it. Every conversation spiraled into arguments, with her insisting I choose between her son and mine. And then came her family. Tessa's mother called, a trembling voice on the line, pleading with me to reconsider pressing charges. "He doesn't understand what he's done. You're destroying his life over an accident." I felt my chest tighten. Mason's grandmother, in her worry, was failing to acknowledge the trauma inflicted on Jake. I listened, silently, letting her vent, but I didn't give in. The only child I could protect was mine. At home, the atmosphere was suffocating. Jake barely ate, barely spoke. He wandered through the house in silence, avoiding Mason and retreating into his room for hours. I tried to maintain normalcy, to anchor him with routines, but even opening the kitchen cabinet or picking up a toy could trigger anxiety. Every step was cautious, every movement measured. I realized Jake had learned to shrink himself to survive in his own home. Meanwhile, Mason's behavior escalated in subtle, yet alarming ways. He would hide Jake's personal items, push boundaries with a sly defiance, and even taunt him about his father. There were moments when I caught him staring, almost admiring the fear he invoked. It was deliberate. I could see it in the way he lingered near Jake's possessions, in the timing of his mischief, always calculated, always precise. Tom tried to mediate, but his attempts only inflamed tensions. He insisted on giving Mason the benefit of the doubt, tried to negotiate compromises, and repeatedly told me to, "Be patient, Emily. He's adjusting." I wanted to trust him, I truly did. But his patience bordered on enabling, and with each passing day, I felt the weight of responsibility shift squarely onto my shoulders. One evening, I caught Mason sneaking into Jake's room, rifling through a box of memories. I confronted him immediately. "Mason, stop! Those are sacred things to Jake. You can't touch them without permission." He looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Relax, I was just curious." The casualness, the deliberate minimization, made my blood run cold. It wasn't curiosity. It was testing limits, seeing how far he could go before there were consequences. That night, I sat with Jake in the living room, exhausted and frustrated. "Jake," I said softly, "I know this is hard. I know it feels like no one understands. But I want you to know something very important. You are safe. I will protect you, always." His small hands gripped mine tightly. "He's going to do it again, isn't he?" he whispered. My heart broke. "Not if I can help it," I said firmly. "Not if I can stop it." The tension seeped into every interaction. Friends tried to mediate, but even their advice seemed to take sides. Some suggested I should give Mason a chance, or try harder to blend the family, ignoring the emotional destruction he had already caused. I realized then that the problem wasn't just Mason or Tessa, it was the network of people around us who refused to see the truth. Inside, I began to change. The Emily who had once tried to accommodate everyone, who had wanted peace at all costs, was slowly giving way to a version hardened by experience and clarity. I couldn't allow anyone else's comfort to endanger my child again. My patience transformed into resolve. My desire to maintain harmony became a commitment to justice and protection. One afternoon, after another incident in which Mason deliberately smashed a school project Jake had been working on, I finally drew a line. I called Tessa, Tom, and even involved the authorities again. Enough, I said. This isn't about family bonding anymore. This is about your son deliberately harming mine. He will face consequences. I will not allow Jake to live in fear. The fallout was immediate. Tessa screamed, accused me of destroying her son's future. Tom tried to negotiate, but I didn't flinch. I had faced grief before, lost before, and now I was facing an entirely new challenge, protecting my son from someone who knew exactly how to hurt him. My resolve was absolute. That night, I sat on the porch looking at the stars, exhausted but unwavering. I thought of my late husband, of the promises I had made to Jake, of the life we were trying to rebuild. Every shard of that broken urn, every tear Jake had cried, was a reminder that some lines could not be crossed. Protecting my child, honoring memory, upholding justice, those were my responsibilities, and I would meet them, no matter the cost. And as I sat there, I realized something profound. The storm outside, the legal battles, the family arguments, the escalating threats, couldn't touch the bond I had with Jake. That bond was unbreakable, rooted in love, memory, and trust. Mason's deliberate actions had tried to undermine it, but they had also revealed a truth I could never ignore. Love isn't always enough. Sometimes protection and courage are what define a parent. By the time evening fell, our home felt like a place I no longer recognized. The walls, once warm with laughter and memories, now seemed cold and accusing. Jake's room remained a fortress of silence, his small body curled on the bed, staring at the wall as if willing the world to disappear. The shattered urn, still carefully swept into a box of fragments, sat like a haunting relic in the corner of the living room. Every glance at it reopened the wound, a visceral reminder of what had been lost. I sat on the couch, knees drawn to my chest, and let the tears come. Not the tears of fleeting sadness, but the deep, aching sorrow that saturates your entire being. My mind replayed Mason's smile, that deliberate expression of triumph, and I felt a rush of helpless fury. How could an 11-year-old be so cruel, and why had Tom, so eager to see the best in his son, failed to see what was obvious to me? Messages and calls from Tessa flooded my phone. "Emily, you're destroying our family," one text read. "How can you protect your son by tearing my family apart?" Another email threatened legal action, painting me as the villain for calling the police, for pressing charges. The cacophony of accusations was relentless, but the real pain came from within. I questioned every decision I had made since Mason entered our lives. Sitting there, I confronted a fear I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. That I had failed Jake. That in trying to create a blended family, I had overlooked the very person I had sworn to protect. That my desire for harmony had put him in harm's way. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, suffocating, relentless. I thought about the moments before the urn was destroyed. The laughter, the balloons, the joy on Jake's face, and how swiftly it had been shattered. It wasn't just the physical destruction. It was a betrayal of the fragile sense of safety I had worked so hard to rebuild for him. My grief, still raw from the loss of my husband 3 years ago, collided with the present trauma. I felt as if I were being pulled under by currents I could not control. Alone in the kitchen, I stared at the sink, my hands gripping the edge until my knuckles turned white. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I could hear the distant sound of cars outside, the faint murmur of neighbors, but it felt disconnected from our reality. Our home, my sanctuary with Jake, had been violated. The rules of our world, the trust I had built, had been shattered by someone who did not care about consequences. Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shards of the urn, felt the cold stone hearth beneath Mason's hand as he threw it, and heard Jake's scream piercing through the silence. I questioned whether I was strong enough, whether I could withstand the legal battles, the confrontations with Tessa, and the ongoing fear for Jake's well-being. A profound loneliness settled over me. Friends offered advice, but even their words felt inadequate. They could not feel the sharp edges of Jake's grief, the heavy responsibility I carried as both parent and protector. Tom's attempts at reconciliation with Mason and mediation with me only heightened the sense of isolation. I realized that at this moment, No one could fight this battle for me. I had to face it alone. And yet, in that darkness, a small, stubborn spark of resolve flickered. I remembered my husband's faith in me, his unwavering trust that I would care for Jake in ways only a mother could. I remembered the promises I had made, not just to him, but to myself and to the son who depended on me. Though the path ahead was uncertain, though the shadows of despair pressed in from all sides, I knew that giving up was not an option. I allowed myself to grieve fully that night, letting the tears flow without restraint. But as dawn approached, I realized that the bottom I had reached was not the end. It was a turning point. I had hit a place so low that the only direction left was up. I had faced my fear, my guilt, my exhaustion, and though the road ahead would be treacherous, I understood something vital. The safety, trust, and emotional well-being of my child demanded action, courage, and unwavering resolve. Sitting on the porch the next morning, watching the pale light creep over the horizon, I made a quiet vow to Jake. I will not let anyone hurt you like this again, I whispered to the empty air, but my heart knew he was listening. And for the first time since the incident, I felt the faint stirrings of strength returning, a determination that would guide me through the chaos, through the heartbreak, and into the fight for what mattered most. It all started with a call from the detective assigned to Mason's case. Her voice was measured, professional, but beneath it, I sensed urgency. Emily, after reviewing the evidence and speaking with Mason separately, there's a pattern here you need to understand, she said. I leaned forward, heart pounding, every nerve on high alert. The detective explained that Mason had a history of deliberately targeting items with emotional significance, not just at home, but at school, at friends' houses, projects, personal belongings, things tied to memories and feelings. This isn't impulsive or accidental, she said. He knows what he's doing and why. It's methodical. I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything clicked. The smile, the careful timing, the thrill I'd sensed in him when he threw the urn. This was not about adjustment, trauma, or simple childhood mischief. This was targeted cruelty, and my son had been its latest victim. I confronted Tessa with the information. She broke down, tears streaming, her voice trembling. I didn't want you to leave me, Emily. I minimized it. I told myself he just needs time. He's been through trauma. He doesn't understand. Her words tumbled out in a torrent of guilt and fear, but I could see through them. She was afraid, not for her son's behavior, but for herself. And then she said something that crystallized everything. You're choosing your dead husband over my living son. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at her, my chest tight, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. No, I said slowly, my voice steady, despite the storm inside me. I'm choosing my child. I'm choosing Jake's safety. I'm choosing the bond we have, the trust we've rebuilt over 3 years of grief. I'm not choosing the past over the present. I'm choosing protection over excuses. It was in that moment that I understood the truth of my own power. I had spent months, maybe years, trying to accommodate others' emotions, trying to maintain peace, trying to construct a version of family that felt normal. But normal wasn't enough, not when it endangered Jake. I realized I had the strength to draw boundaries, to act decisively, to make choices that honored my child and my late husband's memory. The following days were filled with legal proceedings, tense conversations, and the cold clarity of action. Tessa moved out, taking Mason with her, and I watched as the door closed behind them, a mixture of relief and sorrow washing over me. I felt no triumph in her departure, only a profound sense of resolve. My home was no longer a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. It was a safe haven again. Jake, timid and fragile after the events, clung to me. Mom, he whispered one night, voice small and uncertain, I'm glad you didn't let him stay. I nodded, brushing his hair from his forehead. Me too, buddy. Me too. You're safe now, I promise. And in his eyes, I saw the flicker of relief, the slow return of trust. The turning point wasn't just about legal intervention or the removal of Tessa and Mason. It was about recognizing my own value, my own authority as a mother, and my right to protect my child without guilt or hesitation. I had been strong before, yes, but now I was unshakable. I would no longer compromise my principles for the sake of appeasing others, no matter how close they seemed. That evening, I walked through the living room, my fingers trailing along the mantel where the urn once rested. I breathed in the memories, the grief, and the love. This space had been violated, yes, but it was also a testament to the care and devotion that had shaped our family. I realized that rebuilding didn't mean forgetting. It meant creating something new, resilient, and sacred. I called Jake's grief counselor and arranged an emergency session. "He's been re-traumatized," she said, after meeting with him. "The deliberate nature of this act has shaken his sense of safety, but the fact that you took decisive action, that will teach him something important, that his feelings, his grief, and his well-being matter." In that moment, I understood that protection and love weren't always gentle. Sometimes they required confrontation, clarity, and courage, and I had both. As I tucked Jake into bed that night, he whispered, "Mom, do you think things will ever go back to normal?" I smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Maybe not exactly," I said. "But we'll find a new normal, one where we're safe, where we can grieve, and where we can still laugh. That's our family, that's our bond, and nothing can take that away." I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't known I could carry alone. The darkest moment had revealed a truth I would carry forever. The strength to protect, to honor, and to act decisively was mine. I was no longer a mother adrift in compromise. I was a mother anchored in love, memory, and unwavering resolve. The days after Tessa and Mason moved out felt surreal. The house, once filled with tension and the faint echoes of conflict, settled into a quiet that was almost sacred. I wandered through the living room, now free from the chaos that had infiltrated every corner of our lives. The urn was gone, but in its place, I began planning a new memorial for Jake, a space where grief and love could coexist safely. Tessa's absence was palpable. Calls from her stopped for a while, replaced by frantic messages from her mother and lawyer, pleading, bargaining, accusing. "Emily, please reconsider," her mother sobbed one morning. "He's just a child. You're ruining his life." But I knew better. The only innocent child in this story was Jake, who had witnessed a deliberate act of cruelty that left him reeling. The law and my conscience were aligned. I had made the right decision. Mason, meanwhile, was beginning his court-ordered counseling and community service. The juvenile counselor explained that his deliberate destruction of emotionally significant items had to be addressed, not ignored. For the first time, Tessa's attempts to minimize his behavior were countered by professionals who saw the pattern clearly. "This isn't about punishment," the counselor emphasized. "It's about teaching him empathy and understanding the impact of his actions. He needs boundaries." The court date brought a strange mix of anxiety and relief. Tessa's lawyer argued vehemently that this was a family matter, not a criminal one. But the judge, after reviewing the evidence and hearing from the school counselor, ruled decisively. Mason pleaded guilty to criminal damage to property, was sentenced to 40 hours of community service, ordered to pay restitution for the urn, and mandated to continue counseling for his destructive behavior. The judge's words resonated. This pattern, if left unaddressed, can escalate. Intervention now is essential for his future. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time since that terrible day, I sensed justice, not revenge, but accountability. Tessa, furious with the outcome, claimed I had ruined her son's future. Yet even her own lawyer quietly told her that this was likely the best thing that could happen for Mason. Structured guidance, consequences, and a chance to learn before the pattern deepened. At home, Jake's transformation was subtle but profound. He began sleeping better, his laughter returning in small bursts. We worked together on the memorial garden in the backyard, a space filled with flowers, wind chimes, and a small bench. "Mommy likes it better than the jar anyway," he said one afternoon, patting the soft petals. I smiled, feeling both pride and relief. The garden became a place where grief could be honored safely, a tangible reminder that the past was cherished but no longer threatened. Family and friends, who had been cautious during the chaos, began visiting more often. My sister Riley called regularly, offering support without judgment. "Some people don't get second chances," she reminded me, echoing the sentiment that had fueled my resolve. I realized she was right. Protecting Jake wasn't about punishing Mason or Tessa. It was about safeguarding what truly mattered. Even the court-ordered community service provided unexpected lessons. Mason, tending to the Veterans Memorial Garden, began to understand the value of other people's lives and memories. While I didn't forgive him, I could recognize that accountability and structured guidance might help him grow. My responsibility, however, was no longer his welfare. It was Jake's safety and well-being. For weeks, the emotional weight slowly lifted. I reclaimed routines, quiet breakfasts, bedtime stories, and playful afternoons with Jake. We reestablished boundaries, learned to laugh without fear, and rebuilt the small but precious sense of normalcy we had been deprived of. The trauma was still there, but its sting was less acute. The safety net I provided had become tangible and unshakable. Interestingly, Tessa's absence also brought clarity. Without the constant attempts to rationalize Mason's behavior, I could focus entirely on Jake. We laughed, we grieved, we healed together. The house, once a battlefield, became a sanctuary of resilience. I no longer feared someone's negligence or malice encroaching on our home. I was in control, anchored in my own authority as a mother. Evenings were now moments of reflection and storytelling. Jake would tell me about his day, his dreams, or ask questions about his mom. I encouraged him, not by pretending the past hadn't happened, but by acknowledging it and showing him that safety and love were constant, tangible realities. He had learned, in his small but profound way, that even in a world where people sometimes hurt others deliberately, he could still find refuge, protection, and affirmation. By the time the legal proceedings were fully concluded, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not of triumph over Tessa, but of restored order and moral clarity. I had protected Jake, I had honored the memory of my late husband, and I had reclaimed my home, my agency, and my peace. The fallout, while painful, had reinforced a truth I had always known but had temporarily forgotten. Love is not about compromise at the cost of safety. Love is not about tolerating harm for the sake of appearances. Love is about protection, accountability, and courage. And in that knowledge, I found strength, clarity, and a renewed sense of purpose. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Jake's laughter returned fully, unguarded and bright, echoing through the house like sunlight. He started Little League, something I knew his mom would have been proud of, and his confidence began to bloom. Every morning, he would step into the backyard memorial garden we built together, pat the flowers, and tell his mom about his dreams. In those moments, grief transformed into memory, pain into connection, and the house into a home again. For me, the journey was equally profound. I had faced betrayal, chaos, and deliberate harm, and I had responded with clarity and strength. I learned that being a mother wasn't about being liked or maintaining harmony at all costs. It was about protecting, guiding, and standing firm when it mattered most. The power to act decisively, to defend my child, and to honor the past without being trapped by it had been mine all along. I also realized the truth about blended families. Love alone is never enough. Patience, compassion, and hope can coexist with boundaries and accountability. Children need safety, adults need integrity, and families flourish when respect and protection are non-negotiable. I had spent months excusing behavior, trying to accommodate others' feelings, and sacrificing my child's security. Now I knew the difference. Healing and love thrive only when safety is the foundation. I'm not ruling out love in the future. I may date again, but the next woman in our lives will need to understand one immutable truth. Jake and I are a package deal, and his mother's memory is sacred, not optional. Boundaries matter. Some lines cannot be crossed. And sometimes love requires courage, firmness, and the willingness to stand alone if necessary. As I tucked Jake into bed one night, he looked at me with sleepy eyes and whispered, "Mom, I'm glad you didn't let him stay." I kissed his forehead and smiled, my heart full. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too. We're safe now, and we'll keep each other safe. That's what family means." The lessons I carry forward are clear and unwavering. Protect what matters most. Honor the past without sacrificing the present. Recognize your own strength, and never allow fear or guilt to dictate your choices. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save those we love, and sometimes the courage to act is the truest form of love. Jake and I are moving forward, stronger and more connected than ever. Our home, our memories, and our bond are unshakable. We grieve, we remember, and we live, but always on our terms, with our hearts intact and our sanctuary restored. Some people don't get second chances, but we don't need them. We have each other, and that's everything.